Frank, thank you for joining us today and for being willing, with so much going on this weekend with your family. I'm glad you took the time to be our first person today, so thank you for that. We have just an hour, and so I know there's a lot to share with us, and we'll start. Hitler came to power in 1933. You've told me that your earliest memories began in 1934 when you were about 5 years old. You also said of that time, all in all, it was a good time for your parents. Tell us why that was so and what you can about your family, your life in Gleiwitz in those first few years of your life.
Gleiwitz was a town of about a little over 100,000 people, industrial, in the eastern part of Germany. I had a pretty normal upbringing. As was common, we lived in the middle of town, where my father also had the office, and we had a three-room apartment in back. And I have good memories of that time. I also want to say, you mentioned 1933. Three significant things happened in 1933 that affected my family. One was my father bought a car. It was a tiny convertible, smaller than a bug. But it gave us, he used it not to get around to see anybody because it was faster and easier to take the streetcar, which was right in front of our house, and he could take it to the hospital in 5 minutes. We had about a 5-minute walk to the garage. But what it did was it got me much closer to my grandparents, who lived, my father's parents were in Boyton, which is about 20 miles east, and my mother's family lived in Oppeln, which was maybe 40 miles northwest. We practically traveled every week, and it enriched my life. The other thing that happened was that my grandparents celebrated the 100th anniversary of their family business, which was wholesale leather, including a tannery, and they felt very secure in the community, which ultimately led to their demise. Mm-hmm. The third, of course, was the coming of Hitler, which changed everybody's life completely.
Frank, when your father married your mother, by that time he was fairly well established professionally, wasn't he?
He started a practice, but about a year before. Mm-hmm. He got a very quick start because his main teacher of his residency was in Breslau, which was quite a distance away, and there was no equivalent in Upper Silesia. Mm-hmm. So he really was established pretty early, and as I said, I grew up in a very nice middle-class family.
You did start school in 1935, attending a public school, and you told me that recess was for you the most dangerous time. Will you say a little bit about that?
We had to go outside for about 15 minutes. And at that time, the schoolyard was divided by boys on one side, girls on the other. And we kind of tried to stay in the middle for safety reasons. Also, we started school about 5 minutes late and were told not to come early.
Jewish students, right?
Yes.
Yes, yeah.
We had actually this was for the first 3 years. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. we actually had 3 classrooms, and we also were dismissed 5 minutes early and told to leave because it was most dangerous to be in a group. Individually, you couldn't be singled out. Mm-hmm. But if we were in groups, we were told to disperse and immediately head for home, which we did.
Yeah, because of threats against you,
yes.
Assaults from other kids, right? Yeah.
Yes.
Frank, in 1936, circumstances for your parents turned more ominous and became more difficult, if not dangerous. What changed in 1936, and what did it mean for your family and for you?
In 1921, the Treaty of Riga, which is around the Baltic, basically solidified the boundaries of Poland after the Poland-Russian War, right after the Russian Revolution. That treaty gave minorities on each side of the border protections. It was equal for Poles as well as Germans, and therefore we were protected all minorities were protected for 15 years, and it was in everybody's self-interest to abide by the treaty. At the end of that, basically the Nazis implemented all of the rules and laws which they started in 1933, and that led to my father losing his hospital privileges for every street corner had a Stürmer, which was Goebbels' propaganda newspaper, showing caricatures and basically giving strictly anti-Semitic propaganda. It also started blockades of Jewish schools, Jewish businesses. For instance, any stores were filled with graffiti. There was a brown shirt in front of our apartment house which questioned anybody coming in and threatening them with loss of jobs if they continued to see my father. In addition, he couldn't collect insurance in a country where socialized medicine basically did everything through insurance. And as I said, he lost his hospital privileges. So he knew that this was serious and started looking for ways to leave. Frank? Against the advice and blessing of my mother's parents, who said, somehow we'll get through this, it'll blow over and we can help you.
They'd been there 100 years in business, so they felt
yes.
somewhat secure in that. Frank, in 1936, I believe it was, your mother made a trip to Israel. Tell us about that trip.
She and her brother went to Israel to explore what the possibilities were. And there she found out that there was, in Israel by that time, there was one doctor for every 100 people. And that the only possibilities were to work in a kibbutz or do something which they just felt we weren't suited for.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And so the end of that.
That ended that. And as I said, my mother's brother stayed too long.
Mm-hmm. Frank, it probably was after she came back from that trip, you, or at least in that year, your family decided it was urgent that you needed swimming lessons.
No, that was before.
Before, okay. Okay. Tell us about the urgent swimming lessons.
My parents said that I won't be able to use a swimming pool once that treaty was over in July. And they signed me up for swimming lessons because we might take an ocean voyage, and it would be good judgment to know how to swim. One day, I think it was in June, my grandfather came with me, my father's father, and said, I'm not leaving until you pass a swimming test, which meant that you had to tread water or swim for 20 minutes without stopping. Once I started, I was certified for an hour, and I've liked swimming ever since.
And have continued to be very athletic. Frank, you talked about your maternal grandparents' successful business over 100 years. You shared with me what you called the downhill slide of their business between 1933 and 1938. Say a little bit about that.
Their accountant, Mr. Schnoblich, was not Jewish, and he kept the records of the business, which started with 100,000 marks in 1933 and was down to 20 in 1938.
So an 80% drop in business.
Correct, because of boycotts.
Yeah. And the things you described.
Yes.
With your
By the way, those records are with the museum.
Frank, with your father losing his medical privileges and therefore his practice, how did he make ends meet for the family after that?
Fortunately, they had some savings, and we did the best we could.
I think that includes...
Also, we went, by that time, all bank accounts were frozen, and you were only allowed to spend as much as the government permitted, because taking any more wasn't allowed.
So even if you had the means, you didn't
You
have
couldn't
the access,
use
you
it,
couldn't use them.
and you could not transfer it when we came to the United States.
You shared with me that even though your family didn't keep a kosher kitchen, at that time you only bought kosher meat in Gleiwitz. And why was that?
Gleiwitz had about 1,000 families. They varied between liberal and very orthodox. And everybody bought from the kosher butcher to keep him in business so that the people who needed him had access. It was a very tight-knit community, and everybody tried to help everybody else.
In 1938, in January of 1938, your father made a trip to the United States, which then made it possible for him to move to the United States in June of that year. Tell us about that trip in January and then the events that led up to his departure 6 months later, roughly in June of 1938.
My maternal grandfather had found a cousin. In other words, his father's daughter's husband, who came to him in 1905 and said he urgently needed a loan for 1 week and pleased to help him out. That was given to him. Unfortunately, he used it to come to the United States.
And that was a lot of money, right?
That was a lot of money. It was 3,000 thaler, which was put the business in some danger. They recovered from it, but when we had no relatives in the United States, he suggested that my father see his son, who at that time worked for Bendix Aviation and had a pretty substantial job.
Here in the United States.
In the United States. And he did get an affidavit promising that we won't be on welfare for 1 year. That was a requirement to immigrate to the United States. Because remember, 1938 was the second leg of the Great Depression. In other words, it started in 1929, there was a recovery in 1936 and 37, and then due to a mistake of balancing the budget, 1938 was a second tier of a downturn, which increased unemployment again and led to some pretty hard times.
So he was, this was Charlie Marcus, who was the son of the fellow who took the loan from your grandfather.
Correct,
So
but we did get a visa.
you did get the visa.
And got a number for the quota of immigration from Germany to the United States.
Now, I want you to tell us about Fräulein Schmidt.
You know, when times are tough, it breeds corruption. We got the number in January, and by April, nothing had happened. And due to circumstances and what we're talking about, my father called a friend and said, "What do I do to expedite it? I can't make a living and nothing is happening." He said, "Well, the council has a secretary, a Fräulein Schmidt. Why don't you send her a nice big box of candy in order to help?" And a month later, still nothing happened. And my father called the friend again. He said, "Didn't you put 100 marks into the box of candy?" So she got another box of candy. And about a week later, we got an invitation to take a physical at the consulate in Berlin. And that was in June.
In June.
And we did get a visa end of June. And due to the fact that we weren't able to take any money out, and my father had to study for the state boards in order to get accredited in the United States, he took the next boat with circumstances which forced us to take a German ship. Because if you took the cheapest, rather if you took a first-class ticket, you got a pretty good spending allowance, which you could transfer into American dollars.
If it was a German ship.
If it was a German ship.
Yeah.
And so he proceeded to take, again, the cheapest first-class ticket, got to the United States, decided to study for the state boards in Ohio, because Ohio passed 50% of all foreign applicants, and didn't have an excess of doctors like New York, where fee splitting was 90-10. In other words, if somebody recommended a surgeon, he expected a kickback of 90%. And that's not a good, that isn't a good way to start.
Frank, before we continue with your father coming to the United States, before he got here, after he got the visas, at some point, the Gestapo came to visit him. Will you tell us about that?
Yes. Right after he got the visa, he canceled his lease. Now, in Germany at the time, if the equivalent of a long-term lease required that you give the landlord a mortgage, in other words, you literally lent him money which secured your lease until it's canceled. And with the cancellation, the landlord transferred the amount of the mortgage to my father's bank account, which was at another bank. Somebody at the landlord's bank called the Gestapo and said a large amount of money was just transferred out of the account to Dr. Lieberman. And two Gestapo agents came to his office and said, "Doctor, you're under arrest." He said, "Why?" And he said that you withdrew a large sum of money out of a bank that's not permitted. He was fortunately able to call the president of the bank, who assured the officers that the money was transferred to the frozen account, which couldn't be used, and they left.
And of course,
by the way, I have one thing which I forgot to add, that the visa was good for 120 days. So in order to preserve cash, my mother and I booked our passage for October so that we would close up the household and again preserve cash. So we were apart for about 4 months.
And why were you forced to be apart? Why didn't you go with your father in June?
You were able to take out 10 marks, which is about $2.50.
That's what you were allowed to leave Germany with?
Yes.
Yep.
So during the time that my father was studying, he lived in a furnished room for $5 a week. And of course, we stayed and waited till the last possible minute, and then we lived on the money that we got as spending allowance on the ship.
Because of the ticket he had purchased?
Yes.
So you're there for several more months, 120 days you had. What was that period like for you and your mom?
Kind of tough.
Mm-hmm.
We had moved out. We stayed with another family in a furnished room for about the last month. During this period also, being mischievous, I broke my arm, and my mother immediately, and in a private backyard, which we rented in order to, rather this was done with friends, a so-called Schrebergarten, where, which we used as a playground for about 5 families.
Because you couldn't use public playgrounds or anything, right?
Now, when I broke my arm, you couldn't call 911, one didn't call the police. I felt it was my best judgment, which I kind of questioned. I rode my bicycle home, and successfully. My mother immediately called the hospital. The orthopedist gave an answer, and this was somebody whom they had not socialized with, but gone to dinner with, and had a relationship, said, "Sorry, I don't treat you with children."
And these have been your professional relationships
colleagues.
with your father.
Correct. So my mother frantically got on the phone and reached somebody in my father's hometown that was about 20 miles away, and got an answer that she should take a taxi and go to the back door of the Catholic orphanage. He would meet us there in an hour, and he went on to set my arm, put it in a cast, and then gave instructions for my pediatrician to help exercise it, to straighten, to get the mobility back. She did such a good job that today my left arm bends further than my right one. And we survived that episode.
So for your mother, the fear of having to, of you getting sick or her getting sick, it must have been just a terrifying time for her. She's waiting for this period to end so you can leave.
Well, I had strong, gutsy parents.
Sounds
and I also had quite a bit of freedom. I was able to move on my bicycle. Again, if I was alone, I had no fears. You get certain instincts of what you can do and what you can't do. And they worked up to that point. But we actually left Germany a month before Kristallnacht, which I consider the real start of the Holocaust.
And we're going to come back to that in a moment.
Yes.
When you left, it was at the very end of your 120 days on your visas,
Yes.
very end. As I remember, you were telling me that your father was, because they could communicate at that time, he was trying to urge your mother to leave earlier.
Yes. Let me talk about that. You may or may not have heard about the Munich Treaty, during which the British Prime Minister Chamberlain and the French Prime Minister Daladier had a meeting with Hitler in Munich in September 1938, in which Hitler demanded the Sudeten area, the border of Czechoslovakia, which the two prime ministers gave to Hitler without Czechoslovakia's consent, for the famous quote of Chamberlain saying that this will buy peace in our time. Peace in our time lasted 1 year.
War began the following September.
When the meeting started, Hitler called back all ships at sea and threatened war. That's why we got the cables. When this happened, the ship lost 4 days. It started up, the passage was 6 days, but it left every Saturday. When we got to the ship on October 12th, which was a Saturday, there was no ship when we got to Bremen. We had no idea why, that this had anything to do with Munich. But it took 4 weeks in order to get back on schedule. So the ship came in on Sunday, and we didn't find out everything that happened during this time until we were on the ship. Remember, there was no internet. It was a capital crime to listen to foreign radio stations. There was no free press. Everything was strictly under government control. And this is how the propaganda not only affected all of Germany, but also persuaded the whole world to close Germany for emigration. In other words, there were only 2 places at the end where people could go. One was Shanghai, and the second one was the Dominican Republic, which welcomed the knowledge that people brought.
So Frank, you finally did make the ship. You left Germany. What do you remember of your passage to the United States?
It was during hurricane season. I was fascinated by watching the ship basically dive into a wave, kind of stay under, and then jump up. And boy, did I feel it in the cabin, which was in the front of the ship, when it was like an elevator. At one time, I was one of 6 people in the first-class dining room because the weather was so bad. The other 5 sat at the captain's table. I had my own table.
And if I remember correctly, your mother was very anxious about wanting to get the trip done, and she wanted you to keep a low profile. Of course, there you are, going off and dining by yourself. But she was worried. She was worried the entire trip, from what you told me.
But
you made it. You made it. So tell us about getting to the United States and reuniting with your father. And this was in Cleveland.
He picked us up in New York. At that time, traveling by Greyhound bus. But since I was involved, we took the Empire State Express, which was a 12-hour ride from New York via the so-called water level trip, New York, Albany, Buffalo, Cleveland. And we had my father had rented a 1-bedroom apartment, and this was my home. From the minute we stepped in, there was no question that this was it. And I had a very nice teacher. I was started in 3B, that was about a year behind. There were no TESOL teachers like my wife was to help with teachers for English as a second language. Right. But Miss Manuel was very helpful, and that was my home.
Frank, you were able to bring some goods with you. You couldn't bring money or $2.50, but you brought some goods with you to the United States, including a bicycle. Tell us about the bicycle.
Well, we stayed in Cleveland until my father got word that he passed the state boards, and that Dayton was becoming a successful city at that time, which had a shortage of doctors, and no other Jewish ear, nose, throat specialist, even though he had a very open practice. So when he opened his practice on Valentine's Day, 1939, and that became my home until I was graduated from college.
So when you unpacked when your goods
Now,
arrived,
friends, and I say that in quotes, of my parents had a bicycle shop, and they said, "We'll pack your bicycle to take the least room," and there are special bicycle boxes where you take off the handlebars and make the smallest possible package, and they delivered that to us. And it went, at that time you could still take out furnishings providing you paid 100% tax. In other words, whatever the value was, again, to the government. Mm-hmm. But you could get what was called a lift, which is today would be
a container.
Yeah. And when we got to Dayton, we opened it, and shortly after that got a letter from the friends saying
the ones who packed it for you, yep.
That we should be very careful in opening up the bicycle. They had some forbidden gold coins which they put into the frame and put some black cloth into it to cover it, and they should keep it for them. My father was absolutely livid because that again was a concentration camp offense, even at that time, even before Kristallnacht.
So had it been inspected at Bremerhaven and found...
Correct.
Yeah.
We wouldn't have made it.
You wouldn't have made it.
But he kept those, and in fact made necklaces which went to my wife and my two daughters and my daughter-in-law as a souvenir.
So, I mean, they essentially had you smuggle their goods out at risk to you.
At the end of the war, they wanted a refrigerator. And he said, "You should sell it and get a refrigerator." And he sent the refrigerator, but kept that.
Frank, I'm going to go back to, I think, when you were in Cleveland. You mentioned a little while ago the importance of Kristallnacht, what we call the Night of Broken Glass, November 9th through 10th, 1938. You're in Cleveland. Tell us what that meant for you.
On November 9th, I believe it was a Wednesday, the movies had a special 25-cent admission, and my parents went out for the first time. They asked a neighbor to look in on me once or twice, and all of a sudden at 9 o'clock, I got a collect phone call. In those days, you could call collect because telephoning was much, much more expensive. And you could, on a collect call, you would only pay for it when the party that it's made to accepts it. So this was at 9 o'clock at night, which I knew was 3 o'clock in the morning. And the call was from my mother, from my grandfather, my mother's father. I knew that this was a bad sign. If they called at 3 o'clock in the morning, something was wrong. They finally came back at 10 o'clock. That was probably the longest hour of my life. When my mother accepted the call, they found out that the business had been confiscated, that her two older brothers had been arrested, and that they were desperate to get out. At that time, this was shortly after we got there. My father took the next bus to New York to appeal to the man, to Charlie Marcus, who had given the affidavit. And we never took a penny from him, by the way. By the way, this man had a 1938 income tax return of $38,000.
In 1938.
In 1938,
Yeah.
which is well over $1 million. Since he knew about the theft, that was too close and he was turned down.
Mm-hmm. So you couldn't get the affidavits to bring your
We
grandparents?
were never able to get them out because my father wasn't able to do it on his own at that point.
Right. He wasn't established or anything.
Yes.
Frank, I want to, hopefully we'll have time to come back to that. So now you're in Dayton, your father's, he passed his certification exams, he's setting up practice. Will you tell us what happened first when he tried to start his new practice in Dayton?
He applied for members of the Medical Society, which at that time was kind of the license to legitimacy. After they got the application, they held an emergency meeting on Friday night.
Emergency meeting of the Medical Society.
Of the Medical
Yeah.
Society. On a Friday night, which, as you may know, is a Jewish Sabbath, and passed a resolution requiring citizenship in order to gain admission. Citizenship required, we had already taken out first papers of our desire to become citizens, but it required a 5-year waiting period. And obviously, this was very upsetting. But the next morning, he got a call at the office. He went in, he had office hours every day from basically till 5 o'clock. And on Saturday morning until 12 for people who worked all day. I mean, during the week.
Right.
The reporter came in and said he'd like to see my father. Does he have time? And I said, of course. And he said, I'd like to see your credentials. So he went over it and said, thank you very much. On Sunday morning, the Dayton Herald had an editorial, Freedom of Opportunity in the United States, indicating what had happened with an ex post facto resolution of the Medical Society. Monday morning, 2 good things happened. First of all, he had 11 new patients.
After reading the editorial.
Second of all, he got a call from the chief of staff of Good Samaritan Hospital, offering him hospital privileges. And this really enabled him to get settled and adjusted and feel at home probably faster than almost anybody. I was just admiring my granddaughter's dress, which had lemons. And one of my favorite sayings is, if you get a lemon, make lemonade. The Dayton Herald made the lemonade for us.
Did the Medical Society reverse that decision?
No.
They did
No.
not. They did
No.
not. Frank,
He applied at the end. He didn't even want it.
right, and
And he
thank
never
goodness you didn't.
stepped, he never went into Miami Valley Hospital where he felt where he was told he wasn't welcome.
Frank, tell us, of course, the war began September 1939. The United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor in late 1941. What happened to the rest of your family members? Did any survive, and when did your parents learn what had happened to your family?
First of all, we had my mother's brothers, rather the two older brothers, including a wife and a 5-year-old daughter, had secured a passage to Shanghai in June of 1940. And we're already on the ship in Genoa. It was an Italian ship. On the day that Italy declared war on the Allies, and therefore the ship couldn't get through the Suez Canal. Now, it's Italy declared war when it was obvious that France had fallen and it was safe to be part of the Axis. They basically were sent back, and we didn't get full knowledge of what happened until after the war. We find the Germans were meticulous record keepers. And about 5 years ago, they released all of the records from the concentration camps, which the museum examined and translated, and we did find out that my paternal grandfather, whom my father did manage to get passage through Spain, got sick on the way, and rather than be hospitalized, was sent to Theresienstadt, where he died in 1940. My maternal grandparents were in Theresienstadt until 1940, end of 1943, and that was confirmed by Rabbi Leo Beck, who had married my grandparents and knew my mother. He survived Theresienstadt, and they saw him in visit to Cincinnati in 1945. We also got the records of my mother's brothers, sister-in-law, and of course my cousin, in other words, their daughter, who never had a chance. They all died in Auschwitz, where they were in labor camp, and the minute you got sick or had any problems and went to the, what do you call it, the medical...
like the infirmary?
The clinic infirmary, that was a death sentence. And we got that confirmed through the museum about 5 years ago.
About 5 years ago. Frank, your father, as you explained to us, had gone to New York in the hopes to try to save family members after Kristallnacht in 1938, and he was unable to do so because he wasn't established. He couldn't provide the affidavits. But later, your father played a remarkable role in saving people. And tell us about that.
Well, after World War II, there were a tremendous amount of displaced persons. He personally gave out 107 affidavits guaranteeing that they won't be on welfare, and was the International Hyatt is a refugee resettling organization. He was one of 5 recipients of their 75th anniversary award, together with President Truman. He wasn't able to save his own family, but he felt he needed to do the best he could for others.
107. Wow. Mm-hmm. Remarkable. Frank, your mother wrote a book about the experience, right?
My kids persuaded her to write an autobiography, which she called My Life in Two Worlds, at a time when she had already suffered pretty severely from Parkinson's, with some heavy editing and the very wonderful cooperation of my daughter-in-law. We did put it together. There are copies here at the museum, and there are also copies within the family. And that's...
One last question before we close, Frank, and that is, your wife of 67 years, Mary Ann, who passed away last August, tell us how you met, and there was a coincidence in there somewhere in your lives.
As soon as we got to the United States, we really couldn't travel. First, we couldn't afford it, and during World War II, everybody was busy doing what they had to. By the way, my father was rejected by the draft because of medical requirements, but spent 2 days a week at Memorial Hall examining recruits and draftees. But after World War II, they really wanted to get to know the United States. And we went cross-country and we went probably in 46 of the 48 states.
Wow.
And got to know our country very well and appreciate it. Part of the trip was through New England in 1947, after we had gone cross-country. And I was a family driver. By that time, I was 17. And, no, 18 almost. 18. Yeah, 18, excuse me. And we went through Canada, Gaspé, and they wanted to rest a little bit in the Adirondacks. So, which was a very lively town in the winter, but very boring in summer. And my wife had been at Penn State for summer school, and her parents picked her up and also wanted to rest for a week. We were the only 2 people under 40 in the hotel. And that led to a new family.
Thank you, Frank. I'm going to turn back to Frank in a moment to close our program. I want to thank you all for being here. We didn't have a chance for you to ask Frank some questions. There were so many other things that I wish we could have asked Frank about to share with us, but you've gotten a glimpse here, I think. After Frank finishes, though, we invite you to come up on stage. Frank will stay here for a while, and if you want to come up on stage, meet him, shake his hand, get a picture taken with him, or ask him a question. If you have one that you'd like to ask him, please do so. We hope that you can come back for another first-person program between now and the middle of August, but remind you that we have all of our programs available through the YouTube page of the museum, so you can view Frank's program as well as our other programs. So we hope you take advantage of that. It's our tradition at First Person that our first person gets the last word. And so with that, I'm going to turn back to Frank to close today's program.
Okay, I have a few things to say. First of all, I told you about some of the tough parts of my life. At the same time, I feel I've had a chance to live the American dream. And when I took my kids back they wanted to know where I came from. I had to pinch myself. How could I possibly have grown up there in the kind of society that it is now? And I also want to say that I've made peace with Germany. I find it's 3 generations. You should never blame the children for the sins of their parents. I'm a great believer in what I feel America stands for: our freedoms, our press, and our open society. And I'm happy to be where I am, and I'm proud to have so many of the first and second generation here. And I feel great about it. Thank you.